All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Cody Powers. I'm a partner with ZS out of our New York office. I think just a couple of quick logistical items before we get started today. I think you'll notice in your Zoom panel a couple of different functions, both the Q&A and the chat. I think we'd ask folks as questions come up today, we'd love to be able to address them as they come up and at the end of our presentation today. If you have questions, if you could please use the Q&A function, we'd appreciate it. It helps us to better track questions as they come in and make sure that we're answering them. Things tend to get lost in the chat sometimes. So if you could use the Q&A for any questions, that'd be great. And certainly use the chat if necessary, if there's other commentary that you'd like to add during today's presentation. I'd like to introduce a couple of my colleagues who are also joining us here today, both Jared Levine and Kristen Feldman. Jared, do you want to go ahead?
Certainly, Cody. My name is Jared Levine. I'm a consultant out of ZS's Boston office working with our emerging pharma clients, and I've been at ZS for the last 2 years.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Feldman. I'm a consultant in our San Francisco office, and I'm working in the pipeline and launch strategy space. Welcome, and thanks for joining.
All right, so I think to kick us off today and get us talking about scenario planning, I think we'd like to start with a bit of an exercise. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are planning to launch a new product in January 2021. Would you A, plan for your launch with the assumption that a vaccine is not available, e.g. everything would still have to largely be done virtually, you wouldn't have the ability to run larger events, for example, with your organization, or would you plan with the idea that a vaccine would be available for launch, and therefore you might actually change how you launch your new product? I'm going to go ahead and trigger a poll here that should pop up on your screen. I'll give folks a minute or two to answer. In the meantime, we'll keep moving, and then we'll read off the poll results after we close out. So I think if you think about what the value of thinking through these types of choices, it's that we don't really know how the course of the pandemic will play out. Things are very uncertain. Obviously, things have been very uncertain over the last 6 months, and for better or for worse, that uncertainty isn't going away for several more months. You can imagine that there's a lot that would need to change to bring the pandemic to some form of resolution. So given the uncertainty that still exists today and the way that things could play out, it's about how do I make effective business plans given that uncertainty. So the way that we've been thinking about this isn't so much in trying to predict a certain set of outcomes, but rather if we're able to create a realistic collection of scenarios, we can test our business plans and see how well they adapt to depending on how the pandemic will play out. E.g., you can imagine if there was a vaccine available sooner in the example that I just gave, you may be more aggressive in getting plans such that that you would be having larger group gatherings and so forth, versus if you were more pessimistic and a different scenario played out, maybe that's longer virtual engagement. So that way we think that having a scenario planning based approach helps you see, depending on how the pandemic plays out, that I'm equally prepared in all circumstances. That's not to say that everything is equal across the circumstances. You may prefer one or the other, but that at least you're flexible and you're adaptable depending on what scenario does play out. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here before we move on. You'll see here that the majority of people believe that a vaccine will not be available in January, but will be available at some later point. So I think that's a good context. Sometimes you take the pulse of the room here just to see where people are starting from today, but you can also see that in the poll, some people could see the opposite situation. I think this exactly highlights the need for scenario planning, that depending on your perspective, you could default to a certain scenario, even though the others might also be viable. So what is scenario planning and what is not? So if you look at the exercise we just went through, nowhere in that exercise did we say, well, there's an X% chance of a vaccine being available or not being available. That's an important distinction. I think the temptation is to turn a lot of business planning exercises right now around the pandemic into guesswork around does something or does something not happen. And the challenge with that is there's so much uncertainty and so much random probability at this point. It would be very difficult to be very finite in those answers. And instead, maybe more of the time should be spent trying to bound the answers in the range of potential outcomes. And so rather, the scenario planning exercise just lays out those permutations for you instead and lets you decide for yourself if your business plan is complete. So how do we think about creating what a scenario would look like? Well, at its broadest measure, in terms of what drives public health over the course of pandemic, we believe there's 6 distinct categories that constitute how the pandemic could play. One, the public response. So how do people perceive the nature of the pandemic and how do they react to it? A second, the actual course of the disease. 3, availability of vaccines. 4th, social preventative measures. So these are things like social distancing policies or mask wearing, et cetera. 5th, testing and contact tracing. And then last, of course, treatments. We've grouped the potential outcomes in these 6 to what we're calling our 3 broad potential scenarios. I think why 3? Frankly, it's a simpler way of kind of stress testing. You can imagine that there are hundreds of permutations here. But we believe that if you have 3 distinct enough cases or scenarios, that's enough of an umbrella to make you believe that you stress tested appropriately. So first, in the first scenario there, the space race, this essentially is your optimistic scenario, if you want to call it that the pandemic resolution happens faster. So example, that we're able to bring infection rates under control faster, that testing is more prevalent, that vaccines are available sooner. In the second scenario, it's a step down from that where maybe some regions are moving faster and are able to lower infection rates, but some are not. So that's why we call this kind of this regional outbreak scenario where you see a high degree of variability depending on which region of the world that you're looking at. The last, almost your worst case, if you want to call it that, is what if the virus mutates substantially? Up to this point, the virus has been relatively stable. There are essentially 2 major mutations. But you can imagine if there were a significantly different mutation, one that rendered either vaccine or treatment development less effective, that in some ways it's almost starting from scratch there. So you can imagine that in that case, and if there was a continued lack of coordination across public and private entities, that the virus may have a whole different wave than what we've experienced to date. So where does this play out business-wise? Well, it impacts every aspect of a business's operation. So here we've given a couple of examples, whether it's your company footprint, how you engage with your customers, how you budget, how you forecast. All of these scenarios are designed to help stress test each individual function's plan such that each plan is adaptable and flexible regardless of which circumstance might arise. In terms of the variables that drive these scenarios, you can imagine there are literally hundreds. So on the vaccine end, obviously most people are paying close attention to that. Those I think may be a little bit more obvious. In the course of disease, even things like the downstream impact of disease and morbidity, e.g., we're just starting to really understand the pulmonary impact as well as essentially cardiovascular impact of the virus. When people think about the public response, the one that's probably most notable today, not just compliance with mask policies, but also sentiment around vaccines. Clearly, there's some division depending where in the world that you look to today. On the social preventative measures, obviously these are ones that most people are aware of. There's actually quite a bit of divergence across the world as to what is utilized today. And so you can imagine as those change and evolve over time, that would actually change which scenario that you might be looking at. The testing process, I think obviously what's going to become more closely followed in the next several months is the advent of more widely available rapid testing, particularly the US government's use of the Abbott Binax Now test, which would be the first without requiring a diagnostic piece of machinery. You can imagine that advent of more testing would significantly alter what the course of the pandemic could be. And then last, of course, treatments. So I think most notably remdesivir, obviously with the first EUA here, You could imagine that there is a long list in the pipeline. So whether they be neutralizing antibodies or other types of treatments, that the course of the pandemic, of course, is largely dependent on what types of treatments that we develop. So the types of events that you could imagine here, that depending on what you see, there's either more or less confidence in what you see as resolution and outcome of the pandemic. So for the items that are on the left here, those signify things where maybe there's a greater degree of uncertainty as to how things will play out. Versus once we get to milestones on the right, those are circumstances when we feel like we're getting closer and closer to where we can plan confidently. So essentially, if you are seeing lots of things on the left here in this scenario that's playing out in front of you, that's actually a call for more scenario planning, because there's a whole much broader range of outcomes that could play out, as opposed to on the right, where if we have a better understanding of downstream disease, if there's a better understanding of herd immunity, et cetera, then we can plan more confidently, and the amount of variability to be between scenarios would obviously be much less. If you think about those variables that we discussed, one of the most important things that maybe people are struggling with right now is how the variables interrelate. So it's easy for people, for example, to gravitate towards a vaccine is or is not as available, but there's a lot of other things that may need to change for resolution that depend on each other. So as an example, somewhat paradoxically, if the infection rate is higher, that actually means that vaccine development will happen faster. Essentially, if there's more infection, then you have a better chance of proving whether or not a vaccine is working. But at the same time that infection rate is going up, that has countervailing impact on other aspects of the pandemic. So as an example, if the infection rate is higher, you actually need more testing. So therefore, you're more likely to see gaps in testing. Or if the infection rate is higher, you're more likely to see stricter movement restrictions, which in turn actually limit the impact of vaccine development. So when we lay out the scenarios, it's important to lay out all of these countervailing attributes and not assume that only one or two essentially are moving the system, so to speak, but that we're effectively capturing all of the interdependencies between these variables when we talk about how these scenarios can play. I'm now going to turn over control to Jared, who's going to take us through some example scenarios here. Jared, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Cody. So when we talk to our clients and say, you're launching this new product in the next 6 months, how are you factoring in the pandemic into your plans? A lot of what we hear from some of our clients is, I have an optimistic scenario, I have a pessimistic scenario, but we're just plowing ahead assuming that it'll be the base scenario. But what these fail to take into account is that, what does optimistic mean? What are the assumptions that are underlying these scenarios? How do you recognize whether you are in the optimistic scenario or the base scenario? You can look at sales or you can look at other things, but those are sort of lagging indicators of how you are doing. But most importantly, how does your launch plan, or how do your plans for really key business decisions change based on developments that you see happening? And are you prepared for these changes? So, as Cody mentioned, we have developed 3 possible scenarios. There are many that capture the key developments in those 6 drivers of public health that we were alluding to: social response, vaccine development, treatment development, testing, other things. And so in the first scenario, we have the COVID-19 space race. This is really industry and government coming together and rapidly developing new medical technologies and testing technologies for curbing the course of the pandemic. So on the company side, we have many different players developing vaccines and treatments, as well as more rapid point of care testing solutions. And on the government side, the government is aiding industry mainly in 2 ways. They're providing funding for research and funding for acquiring the technologies once they're developed. And they're also providing regulatory pathways that allow for accelerated development of technologies. We're seeing this with the emergency use authorizations that have occurred. Similarly, this rapid pace of technological development is providing people with a sense of hope. And that hope allows people to withstand and adhere to social distancing guidelines a little more closely and a little longer, because they know that maybe by Q4, the end of 2020, there will be a vaccine or very effective treatment available to them. In the second scenario, the regional outbreak scenario, this is similar to what we're seeing with some countries having a more robust response to the pandemic and being able to flatten that curve a lot quicker. And other countries are not. And even within countries, we're seeing regional differences in adherence to social guidelines, the imposition of social distancing requirements. And also in this scenario, we may see a little bit of pushback to the pace of technological innovation. The pace will still be faster than normal, but pushback from the medical community, even pushback from society, might limit the pace of technological development just a little bit. And we may see a vaccine become available sometime in early 2021. And the last scenario we have, and this is sort of one of the more dire or pessimistic scenarios, is if the virus were to mutate and there would be a lack of coordination at the central or local government level. And at this point, the cases will increase rapidly, and our testing and contact tracing abilities may not be able to cope with it. Combine that with the fact that there will be financial pressures on both public health systems as well as financial pressures on individuals and their businesses. So you might see a much lower level of adherence to social distancing guidelines just because people need to resume their daily activities. And there might also start to begin a little bit of lack of trust in things like government agencies that are regulating the development of technology, just because they rushed some technologies to market and they ended up failing. But ultimately, we could also see the failure of some lead assets in this scenario. So maybe a lead vaccine candidate fails or a really promising treatment fails. And at this moment, I would like to poll the audience and see which of these scenarios do you think are most likely to play out over the next 6 months. I'll let this run for a little bit as we continue on. Just love to hear your thoughts. So even within these scenarios, there are regional and country-specific differences. So let's just take a look at what is representing the floor, the worst-case scenario for some important regions. So we looked at the US, EU, China, the UK, and Japan, and saw how would these scenarios play out in these different countries and regions. So if cases were to spike due to a mutation in the virus or due to a myriad of other reasons, most countries would only be able to test symptomatic patients. As we see that in the US, EU, UK, and Japan, they really haven't, either through choice or through different strategies, they haven't really built up their testing to the point where they could test asymptomatic patients if cases were to spike. On the other hand, we see in China, they already have the ability to test asymptomatic patients and test an entire municipality if a hotspot occurs. And that ability would likely continue even if cases were to spike or the virus were to mutate. With contact tracing, if cases were to spike, most countries would not be able to carry out contact tracing. There's also we're seeing in the West a lot of resistance to contact tracing, either by tech companies or the government, that we're not seeing to the same degree in China and Japan. So in the West, contact tracing really wouldn't be able to take place, especially in the US. In the UK and EU, you are seeing some software acceptance, and that would likely continue if the virus were to mutate in cases to spike. Japan has been able to do contact tracing in a more traditional way, and China has been able to leverage its app-based contact tracing to effectively do contact tracing at a national level. In social preventative measures, we're seeing already regional differences in adherence to social distancing, with high levels of resistance in the US and UK and more sort of individualistic societies, whereas in Japan and China, a little bit more looking out for the common good, we are seeing much higher adherence to things like wearing masks, to quarantining if necessary, and the EU falls somewhere in the middle of that. Treatments are continuing to be developed globally, but maybe some of the lead assets tend to fail and show no improvement over standard of care, or the treatments that are shown to benefit maybe only have a mild to moderate effect. And lastly, with vaccine availability, it's important to note here that there are sort of two important points for vaccine availability. There is the approval, but there's also the ramp up in production and distribution that needs to happen in order for a vaccine to become widely available. So if the virus were to mutate, some of the lead assets may not end up working against the new strains of virus, or they may only work against certain strains of the virus. And so we might see something similar to what we see with flu vaccines. And we wouldn't see vaccine development really occur until late Q4 2021 or even early 2022. So at this point, I'm going to end the polling, and it seems like most people think that things will continue on similar to as they are now, regional outbreaks. Some countries will be more effective at handling the pandemic and others will not. But there are still some people who think that there could be a mutation and things could get worse from here, or things could get better. And that's the sort of thing we're trying to get at, that you need to plan accordingly and be able to react to developments that we see on a day-by-day basis. You can't just be constantly looking back and reacting anew to each new development. So on this slide, we have several key milestones that would indicate that you're moving toward one of the more beneficial scenarios. But you could imagine the exact opposite of these milestones could lead you to think that there's a higher priority of the mutation and lack of coordination scenario. So if we look at a vaccine, if it were to be developed and result in prevention, we're more likely to be in the space race, or if it's a little bit delayed, it could be the regional outbreak scenario. If there was a point of care test that was developed that would allow testing en masse, or even testing outside of traditional healthcare channels, like in a workplace, that would be a very positive development and lead us toward one of the more optimistic scenarios. If a COVID-19 specific neutralizing antibody was approved and used, that could have just as much an impact as a vaccine. Even though most people are thinking that a vaccine is necessary to return to normal, this could be a very beneficial, impactful development. And lastly, if we just saw changes in social response, if we saw more compliance with government guidelines or a more concerted, coordinated effort by the government, that might lead us to think that we're in more of a space race or regional outbreak scenario. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kristen, who's going to talk through some of the business uses of our scenario planning approach.
Great. Thank you, Jared. Thanks, Cody. So now that we're familiar with the scenarios, we'd like to discuss a little bit about how they can be applied to making complex business decisions. So it's important to consider the range of all three of these potential scenarios and the impact they can have across all the various functions in an organization. So for example, when considering the HR function of your organization or your organization's footprint, it's going to be important to consider how each one of these scenarios could potentially affect business challenges like headcount adjustments, or how you're thinking about employee benefits and compensation. Or for example, when you're considering functions that are more focused on your customer and your brand, it'll be important to consider how each one of these scenarios might affect business challenges like fluctuations in demand and product launch timelines, and things like your physical and digital marketing mix. So with that in mind, there's a myriad of business decisions that are going to happen as the pandemic evolves. And the pandemic is certainly going to affect almost all of them. But we're going to speak to just a few of the priority use cases that are going to benefit greatly from scenario planning insights. And we've chosen these use cases based on the fact that they require long-term planning, that there's potentially a lot of risk associated with these use cases, and the fact that they can really impact a breadth of your organization. So for example, when you're considering something like a product launch, there's going to be numerous interrelated and cross-functional decisions that are going to have to be made. From manufacturing to contracting to hiring to marketing decisions. And so thinking about all these decisions from a lens of scenario planning is going to be essential to ensuring that everyone in the organization is prepared to respond to the evolving challenges of launching during a pandemic. Sorry, got ahead of myself. So to bring this to life, we can talk through how a few example decisions can be tailored to milestones in the pandemic. For these examples, we're going to consider the potential milestone in the pandemic of the confirmation that the virus is actually spread via aerosolized droplets. So right now, most businesses are operating under the assumption that the virus is only transmitted from infected individuals in about 6 feet radius. So this means that an infected person might spread through droplets if they cough or sneeze or when they're talking, and that those droplets fall to the ground within about 6 feet of the person. And this is why you see things like tables in a restaurant that are pushed about 6 feet apart, or desks and cubicles that are about 6 feet apart. But this could be a lot different if scientists and public health officials potentially confirm that the virus is spread through small aerosolized particles and that they can travel greater distances. And this might impact many decisions that any organization is going to have to make. So we can walk through each one of these categories and kind of talk through how this milestone could potentially impact specific actions across your business. So let's consider your organizational or operating model. One of the key to business decisions you might need to make is how are we going to restructure our organization based on shifts in headcount? And a potential milestone-driven action, if the virus is actually spread via aerosols, is potentially thinking about how to restructure your sales organization to adapt to more virtual engagements with your customers. And if you're considering your marketing mix, you might be asking questions like, how much should our organization invest in non-personal promotions or digital advertising? And if the virus is aerosolized, one potential milestone-driven action would be to reassess the need for brick and mortar stores based on the stickiness of your customer behaviors. Similarly, if you're thinking about a launch strategy and you're thinking about the hiring activity timelines and FTE requirements that you would have, if the virus is aerosolized, you might think about extending your remote timelines and thinking about ways to reduce the risk of aerosolized infections within your organization. And finally, if you're thinking about things from a corporate financial planning perspective, you might be asking questions like, how can we adapt our capital expenditures? And if the virus is aerosolized, one action you could take would be approving budget policies that are going to account for these adapting and evolving CDC guidelines if the virus is spread. So just wanted to bring some of these to life. So these milestone-driven plans are going to need to address both the high-level strategic direction of your organization, but also the tactical considerations that are going to be critical to keeping your employees and your customers safe and keeping your business effective. So we can show this through a couple examples of this milestone action logic. And let's talk about the disease itself. So some things that could potentially happen, we just discussed the confirmation of aerosolized virus transmissions. And some of the things you might need to plan for are providing N95 masks to employees, or thinking about solutions for the ventilation system in your building and how those might need to be overhauled. Similarly, if down the line there's confirmation of real minimal seasonal variation in the transmission of the virus and peak transmission has already happened, we might plan for movement restrictions to continue until the vaccine happens, and different sorts of actions can be put into place based on these specific milestones. So I'm going to launch one more poll, and I'd like to understand how people are feeling about the potential of a vaccine. So I'm actually, Jared, are you able to launch the next poll for me? Thank you. So the next question is, what would you feel would need to be available to hold a large corporate event? And love to get your thoughts on what it would take for you to feel comfortable with this. So as that's running, we can talk through a little bit more about these potential milestones and how they could affect business. Great. So understanding these scenarios and milestones is going to allow businesses to plan for both immediate actions they can take, but will also enable planning for other key inflection points along the evolution of the pandemic. So some of the immediate actions could include things like reevaluating your office expansions or adjusting your headcount. And as milestones arise, business leaders can be prepared with specific actions in their plans. And so we've given the example of confirming that the virus could be spread through aerosol transmission. And if you've thought through the scenarios and you have specific plans, you may reassess your current office layout, or you may be able to investigate how to remove these aerosolized particles from the workspace. And as these milestones arise, you make subsequent decisions. So say a vaccine is available for a broader population, including your employees. You'd be prepared to either allow your employees to continue working from home while you wait for this vaccine or this milestone, or you could consider how you will begin to provide coverage of the vaccine for your employees that's compliant with all OSHA or other requirements. Similarly, if there's a rapid at-home test available for general public use, well, before that use, you might allow those employees to continue working remotely. But as that test becomes available, you might start to determine whether employees will be required to take these tests, how often, and how to administer them in the point of care. And finally, as we're all hoping to reach herd immunity, you can think through how all of these different inflection points along the journey, the milestones of the pandemic, might affect your business. So I'm going to stop the poll and share the results. So most people would need to would need a vaccine available to everyone before they feel comfortable holding a large corporate event. And so since that's such a moving target at the moment, I think that's something that everybody's got their eye on, but is going to give most people more comfort. That's followed closely by the widespread adoption of mask wearing in society. But I'm also kind of surprised to see that many people have responded that a COVID-19 treatment being available with a 70% cure rate would also give them the comfort to hold a large corporate event. So it's interesting here to see the spread of how everyone is feeling about their confidence to hold a big event. Thanks.